Welcome to Commune. This is Jeff Krasno. Our mission is to spread the ideas and practices of the world's greatest teachers. We do that through online courses, a weekly newsletter, and this podcast. On the show, I excavate perennial spiritual questions like, what is consciousness? What is the nature of reality? How do we live with purpose?
Reality is infinite. We experience a narrow bandwidth of it unless we transcend our senses through meditation.
We delve into practices and modalities that can heal trauma and help us thrive.
Mastering the art and the science of forgiveness is necessary to move through life.
A miracle is a shift in perception from fear to love.
We explore the spiritual traditions that help us acknowledge that we are all connected by a power greater than us.
We are all indeed individuals, yet we need to find collective and communal solutions.
We build a sturdy bridge between personal wellness and societal well-being.
It's only when you get people who are pursuing their dreams, living their truth, and feeling good that we can actually move the needle of society forward.
To learn about our courses, our community, and everything we do, visit us at onecommune.com. Okay, today on the show, I welcome Mark Champagne. Mark is an author, podcast host, and expert interlocutor. Over the years, he has interviewed some of the world's most fascinating entrepreneurs, athletes, musicians, technologists, and thought leaders, including folks like journalist Carl Fussman, hotelier Chip Conley, executive coach and investor Jerry Colonna, environmentalist Paul Hawken, and many, many others. Now, Mark has just published a new book titled Personal Socrates, which is an exploration of questions that shape the lives of world-class performers, questions that have the power to change one's life and work. Now, in the book, Mark draws on his interviews as well as the stories of high performers like Maya Angelou, Coco Chanel, and Kobe Bryant to aggregate a broad series of inflection point questions. He explores the self-inquiry that catapulted people towards greater flourishing and success. And in the presentation of these stories, he invites you to engage in the same process of life inventory. Now, this conversation was a lot of fun. Mark and I probed the specific stories of extraordinary humans and their concomitant seminal questions. We discussed self-inquiry as a science on the self. I suppose if there's any famous quote that encapsulates Mark's work, it's the famous Socrates quip, "The unexamined life is not worth living." In that spirit, we do a lot of examining. So without further delay, here's my conversation with Mark Champagne. Okay, Mark Champagne, good to be with you. Welcome to the Commune Podcast.
Thank you, sir. I can't wait. I mean, I've been a long-time listener and often pause my workouts when I'm listening to this show. So it's an honor to be on the other side with you.
Yeah, well, I apologize for that, but you seem quite fit.
They're good pauses.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to have mal-affected your physique at all, so that's good. Well, I hold in my hand this just a stunning work of art for everyone who has the privilege of watching this visually. But this is the impending release, Personal Socrates. Congratulations on this achievement. It's truly stunning piece of work. Well done.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. It's a two-year journey, or 2-year production and writing journey, I would say, and then probably a good decade of content and study.
Yeah. Well, I'm aware of the gestation period of these kinds of projects, both mentally and psychologically, and then also just in terms of the logistics of publishing and bringing one of these things to birth is no easy task, and it is a remarkable achievement. I'm sure it'll be just the achievement itself is something that we can probe as we excavate the content itself. But so just to set us up a little bit, now this is a book about questions and how we can utilize inquiry as a method of reflection. And, you've aggregated a stunning array of questions. And in some ways, I think of them as thought experiments to be applied on oneself. And you've done that. You've gathered these from a wide variety of thought leaders and intellectuals, artists, executives, athletes, folks like Kobe Bryant, Maya Angelou, Picasso, Steve Jobs, a bunch of others. And I'm excited to probe at a number of them specifically. But perhaps as just an on-ramp to the conversation, you can give us all a little background on how you came to write the book and the questions that arose for you as part of that process.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the book came out of a really tough couple of years, let's just say, after, and I'll provide a little bit of backstory, but essentially the book came out of the realization that we are all, no matter where we're at in life, one question away from a completely different life or different outcome, if you're thinking of business in any sense. And how I got to that point was spending a decade in the corporate world in sales, analytics, and product management, and, following that ladder and doing well in that job. But throughout those years, I had this reflective practice early in the morning, which was journaling. And it started with reading and trying to inject positive information into my mind before starting the day, even 10, 15 minutes, right? Just to start the day with a prime mind. And then all of a sudden, as you're reading more and more and reading profiles and biographies and things like that, 100% of these people had some sort of reflective practice. And they were all asking powerful questions throughout that text. Or then when podcasts started to come online, you would hear in the interviews these massive questions dropped in the conversation. And I remember I always had this annoyance before I was a host myself, was that the question we'd be left, because the arc was usually this. There was a history, there was a story, something was happening, it went up, it hit a climax or a wall, everything exploded. And then the subject on the other side would say something like, and then I thought about this. And then life carried on. But the host would rarely say, well, let's talk about that question. They would jump right into the next business or the next idea and how they navigated that next road. I was writing the question down and thinking, wow, like one question completely pivoted that person's journey. And, even though I was in a different place or not in, similar circumstances, I had my own career and own life and whatnot, like we all do. I would then journal on the question in relation to where I was at and try to get some value from that prompt. And this went on for, like I said, about a decade, 8 to 10 years in that corporate role, until I finally grew frustrated with the digital options for journaling. Because I was traveling a lot, and I was, I had first started doing these practices in a word processor on my computer. And then as I continued to travel, then I would pull out a phone or an iPad or something like that. And I was using note apps, essentially. But there was always this disconnect of copying and pasting these prompts that I kept finding every morning in my reading, and then using them to guide the reflection. So, and at the same time, I think it was helpful at the time. Headspace and Calm on the meditation front were really starting to take off from a mainstream perspective. So there was a bit of a light bulb moment thinking, well, it seems like people are open to digital guidance when it comes to some of these wellness practices. And at the time, there was nothing that existed like that for journaling other than basically a word processor in an app formation. So that's, what ended up happening was I left that job. I partnered up with my brother-in-law and co-founder of the app, Keo. And essentially we set out to create this app, which was guided by prompts. And long story short, we collaborated with a ton of stunning brands and humans, people like Adam Grant and brands like Lego and LinkedIn and VaynerMedia and all these different people to get their reflective questions and show people on the other side that, these practices aren't just for meditation teachers or yoga instructors. I was interviewing the chief strategy officer at VaynerMedia or chief of operations of Lego and showing how this stuff can be used in day-to-day life in really any circumstance. And it seemed to resonate well because we ended up reaching about 86.9 million people with the app. Those are store impressions, but nonetheless, we were getting featured, and we were really proud about that because we weren't app developers and had no idea what we were doing. We're just trying to get something out to solve my own problem. Basically, I'll save all the details. But what happened? We reached a lot of people, a lot of features, but that didn't mean our business was working. And our business model was failing us. We weren't making enough money to sustain the further development of the app. We needed more time, more resources, and more mental capacity. We were pretty tapped out on all of those areas, and that's I share this because that's what led to the book. Because at that moment, I'll never forget, I was in a co-working space in Toronto, Canada, and I was looking at the Apple dashboard, which was showing me the app metrics, and I'm looking at that 86.9 million. And my next step is to hit delete from App Store. And a whole flurry of questions, all the wrong questions, essentially started floating through my mind at like warp speed. How could we fail at such a colossal level? What would my ex-colleagues think? That I remember when I was explaining to them that I was leaving to pursue this idea, there was this sense of, wow, like, you're so courageous for doing this. And, I have an idea too, but I just can't, come to terms in leave this job. And here I am now feeling like, my tail's between my legs type thing. And we failed. It's done. And that led to some really deep reflection. So I'll pause there, as I said a lot, but that's that backstory.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'll just probe at that a tiny bit, because the question that's coming up for me as you tell that story is, what is the nature of failure? How do we define failure? What is the feeling that arises in the experience of what it is like to be me that is failure? And this is why self-inquiry or inquiry is so useful, is that as you begin to pull that apart and dissect it, what you're really getting at is, I'm afraid of judgment. It's, what are other people going to think of me when I press delete? What am I going to think of myself? Do I need the approval of others? Is my identity baked in to what I do? Like, all these like super seminal questions. So, I told you I would take you on some tangents here. But I
love it.
So, I looked up question because I was interested in, like, what is the nature of question itself? And I'm about to talk to the question guy. And I just started thinking about it because I've never really dissected the word before. But yeah, if you go back, I think in Latin, it's querere or something like that, which is to ask, but it's also to seek. And if obviously within the word question is quest, a quest to know, and when you apply that quest to know on yourself, you are the subject of your own science experiment. And so you're applying the rigors of the scientific method to your own life. It's like, what is my hypothesis? What is the experiment? What's the observation? What's the reasoning? How do I modify my hypothesis? What's my conclusion about myself? So as you were groping in the dark through this process, what was the question that you landed on that then kind of broke the doors open?
There was one big question that I only was able to get to the prompt by really relying on the present moment and gratitude practices. Thankfully, the 3 years of building that app and interviewing all of these different remarkable humans left all of these practices. But during that hit delete moment, there was so much fear and anxiety about the future and what was next that it was almost impossible to, go back into the database essentially and retrieve all of that stuff without really doing some serious work. And that's where I remember even when hitting delete, there was a moment where I just paused, took a breath and reflected on, well, I'm deleting this. I don't know what's next. It doesn't feel good. It feels terrifying. But at the same time, I'm deleting it on a laptop that most people in the world do not have. And, slowing down and trying to reframe my mind or the narrative that was starting to spin with a quick little exercise on gratitude. And I kept doing that day in and day out for weeks until eventually was able to be clear enough and ask the question, what do I want for my life? And that was the first series of progressive questions that no matter where you go after that question, I mean, it's leading you forward down the path, right down the journey. And for me, it reignited the hope and possibility and the drive. And then that question led to another. And then it, leads to, well, who do you need to speak with? What do you need to do today just to get one step closer to that journey? And that was the moment when the realization was made that question saved me, because without that question, I was going into deep depression. I could feel it. I had worked in mental health in my past life and I knew the triggers and I could feel it. I remember thinking, I can see how easy this would be to slip down a really dark path and, get to a point where, maybe a question wouldn't pull me out of that. Something more serious would have to pull me out. So thankfully in my case, that one question changed everything for me.
Mm. And I think one thing that you just touched on is really important, is that you can come to know the right question, but it's not as if the right answer appears within one sentence in consciousness as just a spontaneous emergence. As you say, this one question also precipitated other questions. So I wonder, can you maybe break down what the process is of addressing the questions, the keystone questions that emerge?
Well, I think at its core, a question gives us the luxury of a pause, right? Whether it's a pause in an autopilot of an internal narrative that's driving you to a place that you don't want to be going, which was at that time for me, or a pause in just general life and society where, we're not thinking and we're just moving through the motions and a day starts, a day finishes, rinse and repeat. We keep going. So for me, that's why I'm obsessed with these questions, because if you find and you land on a question that is relatable to your life and your current circumstances, it can make all the difference. And it gives, again, that luxury of slowing down to answer it. And it sparks our curiosity and trains our curiosity muscles, which is profiled in Chip's profile in the book. But just, it's a way to train our curiosity muscles. Then all of a sudden, we start seeing more questions pop up. And we become more curious in essentially all aspects of life. And we start becoming more clear and more clear. And then from the clarity, we start acting with more intention and start, I'm just explaining how my path was going, but also what I see in all the interviews is that it starts with clarity type seeking questions that then lead to intentional action, or setting, an intention for the day on how you want to feel, how you want to show up for yourself and others and so forth. And it just keeps snowballing in a positive loop.
Yeah. What really resonates there for me is pause. And Viktor Frankl has that, amazing quote that, between stimuli and response lies your growth, right? That's where that pause is, if you can cultivate it. And I think the question helps to precipitate or to instantiate that moment before you just react, you know. And this is a theme that is echoed in Stoicism, mindfulness, and all sorts of spiritual traditions, is to find that pause, to be responsive and not reactive. And it's so easy to become identified with knee-jerk reactions. And oftentimes that is a knee-jerk response to one's judgment of a particular event and not to the event itself. So just that pause is so...
Well, and Jeff, just even asking, you know, when you're in the pause and speaking of judgment, then usually the second question is, well, why? You know, where's that judgment coming from? And then you know, it just starts slowly unpacking it. And to your point, it doesn't, you know, the answer doesn't have to lie in one sentence in one sitting. You know, James Clear says this, you're not going to nail your identity in one go, right? So, you know, be kind to yourself, but you're clear, you know, for going through those steps, and it just becomes, you know, incremental and blocks of progress.
Yeah. And I think this modern society that's so punctuated right now, given everything that's going on, with a lot of outrage, a lot of fear, a lot of anger, and just to be able to find that moment and ask yourself, like, who would I be without that thought? Or who would I be without that feeling or that sensation? And how is that? I didn't even put that thought or that sensation there. It just simply arose as phenomena in awareness. And I can witness it and not fixate or identify with it. You know, it's like this stuff.
Correct.
So I want to get at the title for a second, because it obviously references Greek antiquity. And I think everyone has a general sense of who Socrates was, brilliant philosopher, predecessor of Plato in 5th century BC. But what is the Socratic method, and how is that relevant to this method of questions?
So there's a backstory to the title. And I actually hated the name at first, and it came from the owner of the publishing company, Joey, because when I was explaining kind of my backstory, which I just described to you and the listeners, and then also explaining how I was learning from all of these top level thinkers, Joey immediately said, "Oh, so the Socratic method." I said, "The Socratic what?" Because I like most people, I knew of Socrates and knew essentially very high level philosopher, asked questions, many questions. That was kind of my my level of knowledge without any type of philosophy undergrad or anything like that. So when I started digging into it, though, what fascinated me with Socrates was that here's a guy that has a method that's been developed in, I think it was 469 BC, has stood the test of time, where most of us are doing it without even knowing we're doing it. And there's a way, I think there is a way, or this is where my curiosity sparked with how do we follow the method with more intention and modernize it in some capacity? Because I came across essentially these 6 question types: clarity and challenging assumptions and whatnot. And they were very much so used in an academic setting. You know, Socrates was asking these type of questions to his students and so forth and back and forth. And I can't, without even opening the book, I probably can't rhyme off all 6 types, which was the problem. And the reason for thinking, well, if we can't remember the specifics of the Socratic method, then we're not going to use it intuitively and intentionally. So how can we modernize that? And this is where the structure of the book came into. We can all remember that, starting with being clear and asking questions to unlock and surface more clarity is a great starting point, and then that leads into intentionality and questions to help be more intentional with your thinking and your reactions. And then that's it, because if you do those 2 steps, the third step automatically happens, and that's expansion of opportunity, right? Because then you see the signs, everything seems more clear. Your mind's not fogged with emotion and relationships or situations that are holding you back. You can see, just like a neatly organized room, you can see the back corner of the room. Your mind is clear like that. So then the title really grew on me, because it made sense. And the realization that, you know what, we can all be our own personal Socrates and have essentially like our Socratic coach sitting on our shoulder at all times.
Yeah. I mean, the one quote I know really is, the unexamined life is not worth living. I mean, I feel like that's the tag for the book, more or less.
Yeah, it's in there, actually, that line.
Okay, good. Because, that's really the core of what's happening here in inquiry. And of course, I've always associated the Socratic method with a certain kind of argumentative dialogue between individuals, generally based on posing questions as a means to stimulate critical thinking, but also to refute certain presuppositions that may be on faulty ground. And I see this as almost engaging in that kind of, I think with Plato it became more dialectic. I think that's the term he used. But that you're engaging in this dialectic or this dialogue with yourself. As part of inquiry, which I think is fascinating, because whether we like it or not, we're constantly maintaining this chatterbox in our head, right? Of like, I'm cold, I'll put on a sweater. Are you sure you're cold? I don't know. Maybe we should. I don't know if I never liked living in the Northeast. Maybe I should. Our brain is like on this nonstop chatterbox, anyways. And to tame that and to engage in some kind of more intentional kinds of dialogue, I think can be incredibly useful, and clearly, it has been for you and for so many people. And I really do love the organizing principle that you leveraged for the different types of questions, because, like you, I can't remember the 6. Components.
They're in the book. I mean, we can look at them, but
we can look at them. But I do remember getting clear, living intentionally, and expanding possibility or opportunity. So that is helpful for me. Well, let's dive into some of the questions and some of the thought leaders from the book, because that's kind of where a lot of the meat and potatoes are.
Sure.
And maybe we'll start with our mutual friend, because we can make fun of him with impunity just because he's such a good guy. We both know him. Chip Conley, who is this legendary hotelier. He was kind of the biggest, boutique hotel owner-operator in the United States at one juncture with Joie de Vivre. I stayed at his first hotel, which I believe was the Phoenix in San Francisco, in the Tenderloin, which was pretty gritty, but he renovated an old motel, and it made it so cool. We used to stay there all the time. It's awesome. And now he has this beautiful concept that he's expanded upon called the Modern Elder Academy. We can touch on how that maybe came to be. But let's start with Chip. What was his question, and how did you come to understand it? And then we can probe at it together.
Yeah, Chip is just, I mean, he, as you know, he's just one of those humans that is always willing to help and offer, graciously his time. I remember when I shut the app down, and when I was in that moment in those moments of darkness and feeling lost, I emailed him, and he fired back a few really great questions, essentially. I thought, this is ironic. I'm kind of turning into the question guy, and was just met with questions back. So, I mean, that's a bit of our backstory. And so, Chip, for the people that are in the book, or the profiles that are in the book, that those people are still around today, I've interviewed all of them. So a lot of the the information in the profile and the prompts are inspired by those interviews. And the people that have passed, like the Kobe Bryants and Maya Angelou, had to do a different style of research. But in Chip's case, when we had our conversation, there was a lot of discussion around curiosity and how to train your curiosity muscles, essentially, by asking questions. So his prompt, the opening prompt, is, how can I be the most curious person in the room? And the profile goes through essentially, different practices and different exercises that you can do to kind of shift your perspective and ultimately get to the point where the most curious person in the room is also the most present. And that's where it gets really interesting on the ripple effect of being present. Because we all know someone that, is in, whether it's a Zoom meeting or in person, even Zoom's probably even worse because people think that, that you can't tell when someone's not present in the meeting, but you can. We're pretty smart humans at the end of the day. And, there's just, I think the term that Chip uses, this karmic capitalism or karmic, was it karmic capitalism? I'm probably getting that wrong. Anyway, the idea was essentially leaving people feeling, valued and cherished by giving the presence. And ultimately, when you're doing that, you're also intrigued and you start asking really good questions. And people remember that, right?
Absolutely. Brendan, who we both have a relationship with too, is Brendan Burchard. He's always kind of hammering on this too. It's like, what is the intention that I want to bring into this interaction? And how do I bring presence into that interaction such that the person with whom I'm interacting feels valued and feels heard? And how much value that ultimately provides us, when you establish those parameters of value, and the other idea that this particular prompt brought up for me, which is new to the experience of what it's like to be me, is that I've become very comfortable with being confused. And
explain. I like that.
And this really, for me, ties into curiosity and feeds it. Because, let's say me and basically half the rest of the world have become moonlighting microbiologists over the last 18 months, right? With COVID.
Absolutely.
Okay? So it's I'll tell you everything about ACE2 receptors that you want to know. And, but the first time I was reading about how the spike protein infects a cell and how it connects to an ACE2 receptor and hijacks the capacity of the cell to replicate. I mean, I didn't study any of this. And so the first time I was reading primary source data on the NIH website, I'm like, bloody fucking hell. I'm going to close my laptop up. I don't want to be curious about that. It's too confusing.
Yeah.
But then, and this has happened in my life with a number of things that I've become moderately fluent with, which is just surrendering to the discomfort of confusion. And just nodding your head and going along on that ride and just being persistent and being calm and being present until you understand what the mitochondria does, or you understand what short chain fatty acids do, and of course I didn't go to school in any of these things, but in order to, I think, continue to be curious, you need to drop any worry or any discomfort with confusion. And it's really just opened up a big world. It's almost I don't know what that quote is, but the bigger fire you light in the darkness, all it does is reveal how much more darkness there is.
Oh, that's deep. I like it.
Yeah. So the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And that's just flames your or at least my curiosity. So I love this one. And of course, Chip, he had this great career, and then, he was very surprisingly got a call from Brian Chesky, who's the one of the founders of Airbnb. And Brian was like, come and be on our executive committee. And Chip shows up at Airbnb, and he literally didn't understand a single word anyone was saying, because they were like, well, here's this legendary hospitality guy. But Airbnb was a tech company. So they were using language that he literally had no idea what they were talking about. But what he was really good at was the wisdom of how to organize teams and how to listen and how to be curious. And, for a tech company with a bunch of 20-somethings, there was this role for the modern elder. And it was a very two-way street, because Chip was bringing in a lot of cool insight, but he was also learning so much at the same time. And that's the cool part of it.
Well, and that's the second part or topic of his profile, is just around the concept of who a modern elder is, because Chip is the one that enlightened me on thinking differently, because I think in Western culture in general, we don't have the same level of respect for our elders, let's say, than other cultures, let's say. And going back to that Airbnb experience, at one point, just for the listeners, the teams at Airbnb started referring to Chip as the elder, which he didn't like, right? Because he, when you think of elder, you think of someone that's kind of on their way out. And anyone that knows Chip, I mean, he's far from being on his way out. So he, reframed it and coined the term modern elders. And I just love that, because there's an information share there, right? From, it doesn't matter what age you're at, but I remember around the same time that I had my interview with Chip, I then went on a men's group retreat with Everyman. And one of the exercises was, I'll never forget this, it gives goosebumps just sharing it. We were lined up, and we had our modern elder in front of us, and we were about maybe a foot apart, eyes locked into each other. And there was one prompt. The modern elder had to share or pass on wisdom from their life, and then the younger person, I guess you could say, had to then share, well, what would you like to share and pass on to the modern elder? And there was just this beautiful exchange that had nothing to do with age and had everything to do with wisdom. Wisdom and energy and just, learning together and being a tribe and a community. It was just a, beautiful, beautiful thing. So I really love the work that Chip's up to over at the Modern Elder Academy.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I'm, particularly if you look at indigenous cultures, the role of the elder was such a high esteemed role, because they had so much wisdom to impart. And now, of course, like the allopathic medicine system sort of like, keeps people alive longer, but it also often cubbyholes them in nursing homes, and, where our elders have become seen as nuisances sometimes. And I think we need to reinstantiate this notion of the indigenous culture's respect for the elder. And Chip is obviously on that in spades. So let's talk about some more questions.
Sure.
So there's a journalist and author who I wasn't as aware of until I actually read the book, named Cal Fussman, right? And
Cal.
So talk about Cal a bit and unveil Cal's seminal question.
Cal is, if anyone Googles him or listens to any interviews or podcasts, I'm just warning you, you're going to be on the edge of your seat, just waiting for the story to unfold, because he's one of those people that is poetic in how he speaks, and he speaks slowly, and he's got this raspy voice, and you just hang on the words. And I was listening to his podcast, and over time just got to the point where I would love to interview him and see how he comes up with or thinks about his questions, because he at the time was, I think, right at the tail end of a long career as a writer for Esquire magazine, where he had interviewed a good number of U.S. presidents, and Muhammad Ali, Robert De Niro. I mean, any celebrity you can think of somehow has gone through Cal's tape recorder at that time. And so I wanted to know, how do you ask the best questions? And that's his opening prompt. And I'll never forget what he shared in that. And it's something I use in my own, on my own podcast now. And it was this tactic of putting in the research and the effort